Okay, hey everybody. So I'm going to show you guys just a little bit of a tutorial on what you're going to need to know in order to do lessons 7C and 7D in your workbooks. I'm going to upload these files to Blackboard, but just in case, if you need to find the files, if you go to the MATLAB tab of Blackboard, go to Course Home, you'll get here, and then we're going to need two things. One, we're going to need a spreadsheet. So if you come under Spreadsheets, go ahead and download the Lesson 7 spreadsheets. I already did that. And also, if you need your workbook is also here under Student Materials to Print, in-class student notebook, and you'll get the PDF. And you can scroll down until you find Lesson 7C. So that's what we're going to be using today. Okay, so once we downloaded that, I'm going to go ahead and just go to my downloads and open up that spreadsheet in Excel. We're going to be using 7D in class. Here's all the information that we're going to be using for today's lesson. You notice we can scroll. We've got all these categories here. We've got all these numbers for these different years. Now, there's actually a lot more information that we're going to need for the activity, but it's all here for us. And if you notice, if you scroll to the middle, this note here says that this is all in millions of dollars, right? So I'm not going to go over the entire workbook with you, but just I'm going to point out some of the parts that I think might need a little bit of explanation, and then hopefully you can work through the rest by following the instructions. So to start out on activity 7C, just go ahead and answer this first question just based on looking at the spreadsheet, what you think. Whether certain categories have increased or decreased over time. And that's what we're going to be looking at today, is how we can tell how these categories have changed. So number 2, go ahead and look at number 2, and if you notice number 2, everything that they are referring to here is based on this fact, that this is all in millions of dollars. So go ahead and think about that and see how that helps you answer number 2. So here's where we're going to actually need to start using this data from the table. So if you notice, we have these 3 categories right here: education, national defense, and net interest. And we have 2 years, 2000 and 2014. So we want to get some data to put in here into this little table. So let's go back into our Excel sheet. So we want to look first for education in 2000. So I can come to my Excel sheet. I can come down to this category right here for education, training, employment, and social services, and I can scroll over until I get to the year 2000. And right here at 2000, here's my number. Of course, I have to remember that that's in millions, but that's the number that I can fill into my table. So go ahead and use the table to fill in all the rest of these values, and we're going to be looking at how things have changed from the year 2000 to the year 2014. So, moving on to number 4, one way we can talk about change is called absolute change. So this vocabulary word, it's going to come up more in the course, as well as this word of relative change. So be extra sure that you pay attention to these ideas and see if you can make sense of them. So absolute change is just the most basic idea of change. If you want to know how it changed from 2000 to 2014, we can just subtract the two and see how much they increased or decreased by. So this is called additive reasoning because it's like asking how much should we add or subtract to go from 2000 to 2014. So go ahead and find the absolute changes for all these 3 categories in part A and write them down somewhere. But absolute change is not the only way of talking about change. And in some situations, it's not the most useful way. So let me give you an example. Let's say that I have $10 and you have $1,000. And then we both find a $10 bill on the ground. For me, that $10 bill is a really big deal because I just doubled my money, right? I started with 10, now I have 20. That doubled my money. Whereas if you had $1,000 and you find $10, that's not really that big a deal, right? Our absolute change was both the same. We both increased by $10, but for me, the $10 was a bigger deal because I had less before. So the idea here of relative change is we want to compare to what we started with to see how much of a big deal that actually is, that amount of change. So what we do, there's instructions here, is we're going to take the difference between the newer and older amounts. That is the absolute change, right? So you're already going to have that from before. Then we divide that number by the old amount. And then we always convert the answer to a percentage. That's important as well. Here, your answer will be in whatever units you're talking about. Whereas with relative change, your answer will always be in a percentage. So go ahead and then calculate the relative changes for each of these categories and see what you think. And really think here about these two different types of changes and what the difference is and what they tell you. What do you gain by knowing the absolute change versus knowing the relative change, and how can they be useful? So these two ideas, absolute change and relative change, are definitely going to come up more later on in the course. So once we've looked at that for all of these categories and we've got their absolute and relative changes down, just think a little bit, make some hypothesis or make some guesses about what you think about which of these categories the government is prioritizing and how between the years of 2000 and 2014. Okay, and this was totally my bad, but I was saying, do these for all three categories. For part A through C, you only have to find the changes for education. But for number 5, you're going to go ahead and do it for one of these other categories. So really you only have to do it for 2 of these categories. But again, afterwards, just compare all of this and see what you think about how these categories are changing. So the biggest takeaway to get from this lesson is definitely these new ideas of absolute change and relative change. We actually have formulas for them as well, if you like that type of thing. For absolute change, remember we just subtracted the numbers, so we like to say new minus old as a formula for absolute change. Whereas for relative change, we took that same difference, that new minus old, and we divided it by the older amount. So we go new minus old divided by old for relative change. But the thing is, each of these changes, you only look within a certain category, right? They don't tell you anything about the total. Remember before we were talking about part to part and part to total ratios, where we've never looked at the total yet. So in the next lesson, what we're going to do is we're going to try to factor that in and see how that affects what we're figuring out. So for number 1, in this lesson, what you're going to find is that the education budget has increased. But what are some reasons the education budget would increase? Think about that. There's a lot of reasons that the education budget might have increased. So now, like I said before, what we're going to do is we're going to make a comparison to the total federal outlays. So what you're going to want to do is come up to your previous table you had filled out before, and you're going to add another row to it. In that row, we're going to use the information from our Excel sheet that says total federal outlays. So this row right here. And just like before, grab the number from 2000 and 2014. So go ahead and calculate the absolute change and the relative change for those total federal outlays. And then compare the relative change in the total federal outlays to the relative change in the education category that we looked at before. And think about what that means in terms of the education budget and how it's being prioritized. So now, what we're going to do is we're going to look at this comparison. We're going to do a part to whole ratio. So we're going to compare to find out what percentage of the total budget is being allocated to education. So what we're going to do is we're going to come back to our spreadsheet, and you see here and we have these new rows down here that are blank. We're going to start filling those out. So scrolling all the way to the left, we're going to come over here for education to total. So what I'm going to want to do is, remember, always in Excel, when we want to deal with formulas, we have to put equals at the start. Now I want to divide a part to whole ratio for education to total. So I've first got to scroll up and select the education value from this cell, or from this column. So from 1941, the education was this number. And then I'm going to, up here in my cell, I'm going to divide by, and then I'm going to scroll down to total federal outlays and select that box. And the awesome thing about Excel is if you do this right the first time, once you hit enter, now we have our education to total ratio being calculated, and we can just click and drag this all the way across here, and we have it for all the years, which is great. So you can go through and find specifically your values again for 2000, for 2000 and 2014, and bring those back over here and fill them out in here. So now, to visualize this data better, we're going to want to get a graph of the data. Okay, so there's quite a few ways to create a chart for this, but what I'm finding to be the easiest way is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select this row at the top. This row is representing our years. This is going to be our x-axis. Now, holding on my Mac, it's Command. On yours, if it's Windows, it could be Control. But I'm going to hold Command, and then I'm going to also select this row, row 41, my education to total row. This was those percentages we just calculated. So if I go ahead and insert a line chart, right here, we get the chart that we're looking for. This chart shows us how the education as a percentage of the total budget has changed over time. So already we can see, wow, in the very beginning it was a large percentage of the budget, but it quickly became very small. Sometime between 1965 and 1983, we sort of had a boom here. That's something interesting to think about why that is. We kind of flatlined, and then we've been kind of jaggedy ever since then, right? So this is a nice graph we can look at, and we can make some predictions. So coming back to our workbook, what are some interesting features? I just talked about a few of them. Talk about this graph and think about the historical context and see if you can make any predictions about what was going on there. So for the rest of this activity, all you've got to do is repeat that exact same process with the category for national defense. So again, coming back to Excel, we can move this chart for later if you'd like to compare charts. That same process of finding a percentage, if you need to rewind the video and see what we did, we're going to do the exact same thing, but we're going to use this row, and in that row, we're going to include the ratio of the national defense budget to the total budget, the total outlays. So you can repeat the video if you need to and follow all those steps all the way up to getting another graph, this time of national defense to total. And you could even repeat this process for these other categories, any category, and that gives us a new way to compare how these budgets have changed over time with respect to the total budget. What percentage of the total budget are they taking up? So that's pretty much it for this activity. So again, the big takeaways are going to be the difference between this absolute and relative change, thinking about why we need to have those, why we need to look at both of those things, why they're different from each other, and seeing a little bit of how this type of information can be useful. So you can email your professor if you have any questions, and I hope you guys have a great one.